This episode of the Ambiguously Analytical Podcast is not sponsored by anyone. That's right, it's ad-free. But also, someone please sponsor us. Anyone.
Hey everyone, on the Ambiguously Analytical Podcast, we discuss the economic impact of the pandemic, pre-existing and emerging issues impacting the U.S. economy, and make wild but educated guesses about the post-pandemic economy. I'm Michael.
I'm Alven.
And so together we're going to be doing this podcast. This is actually our first episode, and the topic is going to be it's going to be a little bit about the pandemic, but it's more going to be about the impact of the pandemic on real estate and how that might change the New York economy or change New York life, or, if it will change New York life. To begin with, we were both in New York here. We were both podcasting right now from New York. And so we were both here for the entire COVID-19 situation here. New York was kind of ground zero in a lot of ways for the pandemic in the US. So we went through all the phases of the pandemic. We were through the whole ultra lockdown where you couldn't go outside. So, we experienced all that. We experienced the gradual recovery, like the slow opening. And, it's been very even here. Whereas in other parts of the US, it's been very kind of like, I don't know how to phrase it, just sort of sporadic recovery, then lockdown, sort of spikes in coronavirus. And since we're in the middle of the second coronavirus outbreak, or the second wave, so to speak, going through the whole country right now, we thought it'd be interesting to talk about New York's recovery and what's going on here. Because, New York is probably, hopefully, knock on wood, not going to have another gigantic shutdown. So here, the economy's kind of restarted, and the recovery is going a little bit better here than it would in one of the other areas that is potentially going to be facing a second shutdown. So it's a little easier to see where things are going here than it would be in a place like, say, like southern part of California, or somewhere where there's like a ton of COVID cases right now.
Yeah.
So how have, you're younger than me by quite a bit. So how has this kind of been impacting the people you know? Because they're all young, they don't have jobs.
No,
what's
of
been
course.
happening is normally after graduation, since you went to a pretty good school, there'd be a lot of your classmates still in New York, or at least going to grad school or going abroad or something, not even going abroad, staying in New York and working at a bank or something. What's been happening with that? Have your
well, most students who are still students, I know, have chosen to just stay at home and not come to school. Fordham, the university that I graduated from, Fordham offers in-person classes, but most people definitely chose to opt out of that, especially those who are, say, from the West Coast.
Yeah.
Right. And there are fellow graduates I know who have been, because work from home has been working so well. I mean, it's probably the only thing that's been working well. They have just chosen to not be in the city, and some people have chosen to travel, which is pretty rare actually. And there are people I know who have simply gave up on their grad school plans because they don't have the income for that anymore. Just to also clarify, we are recording this on October 16th. So like Michael said, we're sort of in the middle of the second wave.
Yeah, although it's actually not too bad here in New York. We've got doubled cases, but they aren't really rising so much now since there's been a lot of pressure. I mean, the virus is kind of spreading in a couple of communities, so maybe there's some issue with underreporting. I don't know, but in general, I'm not as worried about New York as I would be about somewhere like the Midwest or Minnesota or something like that, where they're actually experiencing all-time highs.
Yeah,
because this disease is one where if you don't wipe it right out when it's getting a little bit larger, it's doubling. So doubles, I forget what the double rate is. 2 weeks or something like that. So, it's going to grow exponentially for a lot of those places.
Yeah,
Double
and the
of
city,
200 is 500.
yeah, and the city has taken, I think, stricter measures in areas that are doing especially bad.
Yeah.
There are a few areas in Brooklyn that are just flat out denied to follow any social distance or mask wearing rules.
Yeah.
And I think the city has a lot banned any business to be open in these regions.
Yeah. So I mean, the city seems to be acting responsibly in general.
Yeah.
The leadership anyway is doing more or less what they can. I mean,
Well, I guess
I don't
depends
want to
who
turn
you're
this
asking.
into a podcast about COVID policy or something like that.
Yeah.
But the big effect of this essentially is that you have a lot of people who aren't living in New York anymore for various reasons. I mean, like you said,
Yeah.
work from home is working quite well, especially for a lot of larger companies. And it's a good thing in general because that was going to happen anyway. So this is kind of accelerating. But on the flip side, what does that mean for the city? Because not everyone can do remote work, and like a lot of the people who are employed here in the city didn't work jobs that you can do remotely. Like, especially the people who had lower incomes. You're talking about like servers, people who work in hotels,
Right.
people who work in retail, right? And
Right.
so as a result of like a lot of the high-end real estate, a lot of people would normally be occupying high-end, residential real estate. Technically it's commercial real estate, but for the purposes of you guys, the viewers, we'll call it residential real estate. When we say that, we're talking about multifamily units, multifamily rental units, which just means typical apartment in New York that you rent. So, these residential, I'm going to put that in air quotes, these residential places like these are experiencing a lot of people leaving the city, so the rent goes down. Essentially that's what's going on all over the city. You yourself, Alvin, you were having some negotiating going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I talked to, it wasn't really a hard negotiation, but I was able to get a concession, not a discount, a concession of 2.5 months to renew my new lease for 1 year.
Well, I remember hearing a lot of these luxury units had like lower numbers of people. Recently we're experiencing like a lot of vacancies in general, because I know like I also used to live in a luxury unit, and like I remember back then like I would say maybe a quarter of the units just sat vacant. And I'm not 100% sure if that's because no one was living in them or if that's because basically the person who lived in it was always traveling. Because I know the guy who lived across the hall from me was a consultant, and he was only in his apartment like one day a week, if that. So, yeah, but yeah, there's a lot less demand, so to speak. So, the prices logically would go down.
Right.
And, this has really been hitting the hotel industry pretty hard. So it's been a real issue for hotels, because there aren't long-term residents in hotels these days, or there are very few of them. Like this isn't the 50s where like a movie star lives in the hotel's penthouse. That just doesn't really happen these days, as far as I know. Like maybe it does, and I'm just not rich enough.
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah, maybe there's secret rich people hotel rooms that you.
Yeah, well, I mean,
you
not
don't
even secret.
know.
Like famous movie stars, they would rather than living in like some mansion in Beverly Hills, a lot of them would live in like a hotel.
Yeah, hotels, because they're service.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Because they're, famous people are better than everyone else. So.
Yeah, they deserve it. Right.
But yeah, you do really raise a good point, and I think that's the elephant in the room, is that commercial real estate is taking a huge hit. And do you want to talk about how that is problematic for New Yorkers in general?
Sure. So, this kind of ties in to what I was just talking about, where you say that a lot of New Yorkers can't work from home, right? So that's specifically, you're talking about hotel, retail, chefs and restaurants, and the restaurant industry is a whole other topic that's really interesting to see which restaurants didn't survive. But The thing with hotels, of course, is, if no one can travel, then, what's a hotel going to do? And then, of course, the issue is of now that New York is recovering, you have the issue where can people from the rest of the country come here? And if they do, what are the restrictions? Like, hotels have to manage that. Is there liability for them? All these sorts of issues sort of play into it, where the hotel industry is hurting really bad. And that has a ripple effect, And so what happens when a hotel does badly, right? It goes bankrupt eventually, right? It goes out of business.
Yes.
So it's the same sort of situation.
The F word.
Happens? Yeah, foreclosure, right? So this actually kind of ties into what you experienced in your negotiation, right?
Right.
Because if we go back to that, like, why do you think it was that they didn't give you a rental decrease? They gave you 3 months.
Well, I mean,
they're legally distinct.
I guess some money is better than nothing. They don't want me to move out.
Well, yeah, of course, they don't want you to move out, but specifically, they didn't reduce your rent, right? You still have the same official rent.
Oh, yeah, cash flow.
Yeah. Well, It's not even that, right? So it's like a lot of these places, this is my guess. I don't know exactly how your building was financed, but I would imagine that a significant reason for this is that somehow in some term of their mortgage, or maybe if they got some mezzanine financing or something, somewhere in there, like they used specific rent values to like kind of reduce the amount of like the amount of money they had to put into the mortgage at the beginning,
Right.
So typically
for
the down payment.
For
I'm talking
viewers,
about the down payment.
Right. For our viewers and listeners, can you explain what mezzanine financing is?
So mezzanine financing is kind of a complex topic, particularly if you don't know much about finance, but to kind of wrap it up in a really simple sort of package and put a little bow tie on it.
Without getting too much into accounting.
Typically you can only take out one mortgage on a building, right?
Yeah.
Typically only one bank will provide you a loan. So what do you do if you need more money for something else? Or if the mortgage they're offering you doesn't pay for the whole building, well, then you do some of the chicanery, like you're counting rents as your assets and putting that in, like, so you don't have to make as large of a down payment. And if that's still not enough, or if you need some money for like some updates to the building or upgrades in some way, you can get what's called mezzanine financing, which is just some other party that is not technically a bank is giving you money to do something. And then as a result, if you don't pay them, they get basically
they get control of the company.
Yeah, they get control of the company, or partial control, or full. It depends on the terms of the financing, but essentially, yeah, it means that this secondary group gets your business, and if they get the business, that means in this case that they get the building too. And then, of course, at that point, they are the ones technically responsible for the mortgage, right? Not you anymore. You don't have your business anymore.
So going back to our storyline, let's say I own a hotel, and I am not making profit, and I'm facing foreclosure, and I'm financed by some kind of mezzanine debt. What do I do?
Well, the first thing you do is try and negotiate, right? And so that's kind of been, what was it back? I think it was back in March or something? They made foreclosures just in general, bank foreclosures at least, were illegal in New York for like 6 or 7 months. And they were considering extending it. I don't recall hearing that they did. So, during that time, though, mezzanine foreclosures were still valid. But the problem was, with a lot of these terms, you have to go through a judge. So the mezzanine debt had to kind of like, the mezzanine debt holders had to prove that selling the building was the right decision for the business,
Right. Which is called judicial foreclosure.
Yeah. So it can be hard sometimes. But essentially, you try to negotiate. But it kind of depends on the terms with the debt holder. Like, when are they going to get paid out? Like, what happens like, are they first in line to get money? Are they second in line to get money? And each one's going to have a different interest, right? So if we go back to the apartment that you're in, or like say one of these various retail storefronts in Manhattan that's like going out of business and has nothing in it for like a year or something like that or more, right? Basically, these guys are waiting and praying because the terms that they got these mortgages under, or the mezzanine loan or whatever, is it's based on the rent, right? It's based on a certain price of rent. And if the price of rent goes down, they're suddenly responsible for paying that difference. So, you know, say you got like a $10 million mortgage or something, right? And then that mortgage was based on you having like $500,000 a year in rent or something like that. Then if all of a sudden you have to give a discount and you only get like $400,000 in rent, suddenly you owe like another $1 million, like, or something like that. And they don't have that money. So what can they do? They work with the bank and they just kind of kick it down the road. And so that's kind of what's been happening a lot here in New York, is they've been kicking it down the road. But the problem is, you know, that ended like a couple months ago, right? So now they're not kicking down the road anymore. They're just flat out foreclosing on people. So, you know, what happens, you know, like, what happens now that these just like waiting doesn't work anymore? Because after they foreclose, you got this new entity, right? And this new entity, say the bank or the mezzanine debt company, which is probably like some PE fund or something like that. But anyway, like,
and it's not like they're gonna come up with a real estate management department all of a sudden.
Yeah, exactly. They aren't specialized in that. They're specialized in making loans, basically. Yeah. So, you know, what happens then? Well, they're just like, I don't know what the heck to do with this. I'll sell it, you know? And so it, you know, all that means is all of a sudden you've got these two different competing forces that are both putting the same pressure on the economy in New York, which is basically you got people fleeing the city. You have these companies that can't pay their mortgages back. All this stuff is conspiring to put large amounts of real estate on the market. You've got two different forces that are both pushing to create a huge amount of supply of real estate, right? So you've got these various entities that are either receiving these distressed loans and like figuring out what they have to do with the actual property itself. Like a bank is like, well, what do we do with this foreclosure, like this hotel we foreclosed on? And you've got these mezzanine loans that are pushing the company to sell, or they've suddenly got control of the company and now they want to sell because neither of them, like not the banks, not lenders, nobody really wants to run a property company, right? So what does that mean? That means the property is all going to go up on market, right? So we kind of end up in this situation where everybody's got this toxic property. No one knows what to do with it, so to speak. So everyone's trying to figure out what's going to happen. So I was thinking, you know, like this is something very similar to 2008, 2009.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, basically what happened in 08, 09 was that the huge amount of single family or housing foreclosure wiped out the securities that were backed by what was called subprime mortgages. Basically, subprime mortgages are the mortgages that were very dangerous. And that led to a decline in housing development, lack of supply, increase in demand, drop of home prices. But all of the houses in 08, 09 turned out eventually got sold at, well, not all of them, but most of them got sold at discounted prices.
With the 2008, 2009 crisis, right? Well, it's not so much the foreclosures as it was the credit crunch, right? All of a sudden, all these banks couldn't loan anything to anybody because they didn't have any money to loan, right? They weren't capitalized properly. So, you know, that was a big issue. All of a sudden, like a lot of short-term loans, like corporate paper and stuff like that, like the whole economy was running on short-term loans. And I guess to an extent it still does, but it's not quite the same because it's now the banks are better capitalized, they're better able to handle a lot of these things crashing. So when all these various short-term loans could no longer function, right? all of a sudden the banks were in danger of collapsing. And some of them did. You know, Bear Stearns went under. Like there was a lot of worry for a lot of banks. You had the TARP, you know, that ended up kind of saving the economy in a lot of ways. So, you know, is that going to happen this time? I don't know if that's actually going to happen this time, because there's a really big difference between now and then. And the big difference is the banks are better capitalized, right? That last recession was like, you know, 10 years ago. The people who experienced it are still working at the bank, you know, so the lesson is still learned. So the banks this time immediately actually pulled in and kind of started becoming more conservative about mortgages and renting, you know, like who they'd issue mortgages to. They became much more careful about that.
Low leverage, strong cash flow.
Yeah. And so, you know, I personally was actually looking around considering purchasing property, but it was actually hard for even me to get like a decent mortgage right now. So we ended up deciding to not buy. But, you know, that's kind of the big difference here, right? The banks are not in danger. So what does that mean if the banks aren't in danger and there's still some line of credit, right? Well, this kind of ties in because, you know, the stock market's been exploding recently, right? And so big driver of that, tech companies, right? Tech companies and various various companies that can function with work from home, right? So when these work from home companies, any company that, you know, can deal with work from home, they're still fine, right? Which means, and there's a low chance that these companies are going to go out of business too. So what happens? That means the banks are willing to lend to them, right? So you end up with the so-called K-shaped recovery that people are talking about right now, right? Where the low-end companies that were doing badly are gone. A lot of issues with tourism, like restaurants, those are all facing issues. Like brick and mortar retail is having issues. But then you have these other companies that aren't, right? So, you know, what ends up happening? Well, there's a lot of money that's available, right? If there's a lot of money that's available, it's got to go somewhere. So, you know, this kind of ties into everyone trying to figure out how do you get the economy restarted, right? How do you kickstart consumption or whatever? That's kind of what the original stimulus was intended to do, right?
Right. So the options we have are basically either building new things, new companies, or converting existing spaces into other kinds of spaces. Like, for example, I know we talked about Neiman Marcus converting into possibly an office, the Neiman Marcus at Hudson Yard. Right. Okay, I have another question. So on a macro level, what do you think the government can do about this?
Like, how do you kickstart consumption? It's a huge question, right? Like, if you can answer that, you can go get a Nobel Prize right now, right? Well,
it is a podcast of wild guesses.
Right. So, you know, who knows? Like, honestly, who knows? Like, there are a lot of people, like a lot of countries, like years ago, they were facing stagflation kind of things, like Japan was having issues with deflation, right? And they ended up actually
proposing negative interest rates.
Yeah, negative interest rates. I mean, I think that would be a terrible idea, personally. But
can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you think about negative interest rates, like, what does that actually mean in a practical sense, right? It means that all of a sudden banks are kind of like paying to make loans, right? And so what does that mean in a practical sense in our current situation, right? Because we just talked about the K-shaped recovery, right? So if it's a K-shaped recovery, then you know, all of a sudden, what are you actually doing if you make credit even easier to get? It's not going to be the people at the bottom that get the credit. It's just not. These failing companies, they're not going to get credit. Who the hell would give them credit, you know? So instead, what ends up happening is you get the top companies getting even more credit. So what would that mean? It just means a huge, like, boost to income inequality, and like it's bad.
Like it's not already big enough.
Like it's not big enough already. So, you know, what does that mean in the long term? It's just like another giant sucking sound as all the human capital in the US goes down the drain. Like, it's a terrible idea, you know, and I can understand why people might think so, because all of a sudden you're trying to move credit. Like, But
Right.
what you're actually doing is you're hurting the people at the bottom very badly. And in the end, you're just giving cheaper loans to the people at the top. And that's not the way you, that's not going to create a recovery, right? That's not going to increase consumption.
Right.
Like in reality, that's going to decrease consumption in the long run. Because, you know, who, like, the stock market rising is great, right? And there are a lot of new investors entering the stock market, like retail investors or whatever. But the crazy bastards on like Wall Street bets or whatever, like a lot of people are entering the market. But the issue you're going to face essentially is that the people who are not in the real estate, like not entering the market, who don't have any kind of stock, who don't have any kind of equity, right?
Yeah.
They aren't necessarily going to start having equity just because all of a sudden there are negative interest rates. All you're going to do is wipe out their bank accounts. Like, they're just like, what are you going to do? They're going to store their money in the mattress. Like, they aren't sophisticated investors. Like, maybe all of a sudden everyone enters the market, but I mean, you know, it's not a solution to me. Although I think these guys would be an interesting thing to talk about, you know, another week. But
it's not like if the Fed introduced a negative interest rate and everyone's just going to take out a mortgage all of a sudden.
I mean, they might not be able to, because ultimately the banks still have to make the mortgage. If you're going to do something like that, it would have to be paired with like a public program where they're making loans and mortgages available to low income people, because otherwise there's just no reason to do it. And, you know, actually that kind of policy is to an extent that got implemented in the Clinton era, you know, and the home ownership soared. But then, you know, near the tail end of that, the ninja loans and the really bad, you know, underperforming loans that ended up causing the financial crisis happen too, when it got out of hand. So, you know, can the government be trusted to moderate this? I don't know, probably not. Can the banks, you know, when they get the chance, be trusted to moderate this? Maybe, I don't know. So, you know, but to bring it back to our original topic, which is, you know, the real estate, right? It's like you said, the conversions, right? Because the real estate's there, it's built. There are more buildings going up. It's there, right?
Yeah.
And it takes years to make this. And so, like, you remember, like 2, 3, 4 years ago, however many it was, like fidget spinners were super big, and there were like millions of fidget spinners everywhere, right? And then the demand cratered. So what happened? People stopped making fidget spinners because they're low capital. Like, no one cares about them anymore. The companies that made them make like, who knows what they make? IETs for all I know. like.
But yeah, it's not an ever-changing industry.
Yeah. So
well, in a sense, it is, but it's fairly stable in the short term.
Yeah, well, you got to figure out what to do with them, right?
Right.
It's not like you have like a million fidget spinners and you have to like do something with them, right?
Yeah.
Like you can just throw the fidget spinners in the garbage or melt them down or something. But real estate's, you can't just destroy it, because destroying, like demolishing it, takes money too. Like, so you have to do something with all this stuff that's going on to market. So you're right. I think
just for our listeners, please don't throw fidget spinners in the garbage or melt it down.
If you're not.
For environmental reasons. If you still have fidget spinners.
Yeah, send them to us. We'll responsibly dispose of them by throwing them off the top of the building. Play taps while we do it.
That's the way to go.
Yeah, but anyway, like you're right. Like, and you brought up Neiman Marcus, which is a huge retail location that was going up in Hudson Yards recently, and super pretty. I went in there. It's nice. It was really nice, and it's gone now. So is Neiman Marcus. But
the whole Hudson Yard thing?
Like not the whole Hudson. I don't think everything is, but they had a huge store in Hudson Yards.
Yeah,
massive.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the developers who were originally renting out to Neiman Marcus now have to figure out what to do with that, right?
Right.
And so you've got the same sort of issue facing all sorts of different companies. Like we were talking about how the banks are going to have to foreclose, or, you know, private lenders are going to be having to figure out what to do with these properties, right?
Right.
And so if all of a sudden, you know, hotels aren't doing well now, maybe when are they going to pick back up? It's hard to say. They'll pick back up eventually. What are you going to do with all these retail locations? Since so many people have started buying stuff online, you know, there's going to be less demand for retail like actual in-person retail stores. So what do? You're right. You're gonna have to convert. Like that is essentially the probably the most likely thing to happen.
Right.
Because
Unless for some ridiculous reason it's cheaper and easier to tear down and build a new thing.
Well, I mean, it might be cheaper to tear down a building, but then the question is,
But also,
all right, so look, in every business class, they'll be teaching you, I would say, all right, so this was my experience anyway, I would say a business school education, from what I could tell, is essentially teaching people teaching people about the sunk cost fallacy. Like,
explain. I'm excited.
Yeah, so I mean, that is essentially it. Like all this other stuff is something that everybody kind of figure out on their own. But like, is that going to happen? That could happen. Like all these companies could be like, well, our options are to try to spend all this money to convert it and try and do something with it, or to just tear it down. Maybe that could happen. But I don't think we're at that point yet where real estate is so terrible they just abandon it. Like. No. And ultimately, I think that is more likely to happen, is that it would get abandoned rather than just demolished and rebuilt. Because, land in Manhattan and New York in general is expensive. So there's no reason to just like, to leave it empty, to leave it fallow, right? Someone will buy it. So, we're coming into this kind of ties back to the K-shaped recession, the K-shaped recovery, right? Because you've got these tech companies, right, that have tons of money. Absolutely tons of money. They're still growing, right? And all these retail locations, they're actually kind of pushing them out. And so, I think these tech companies are going to be the big buyers, like the big converters, so to speak, of this stuff. So, maybe something like Neiman Marcus, not Neiman Marcus in particular, but maybe some other large, retail location is actually going to become an Amazon distribution center. Like, it's hard to say, but I think ultimately what you're going to see is a lot of these tech companies are going to just surge in and start buying up leases and like doing something with it, converting it. Maybe they'll turn it into residential stuff, because this is like something a lot of people maybe don't quite understand about tech companies, right? Is that a lot of tech companies are kind of at the ceiling, like for what they can do with their main cash cow. Like, Google absolutely dominates search within AdWords, Facebook has YouTube, which is, what's that?
And cloud computing.
Yeah. And you got Facebook, which is dominant through Instagram and all that. TikTok is rising, of course, but you have you've got all these various tech companies that are the best at what they do essentially, and they've got huge dominant market share. And trying to increase the money you get from that is going to be kind of like bringing blood from a stone. Like it's hard. You can't, like, there's nothing left. So all these different companies are branching out in new directions, right? You've got Amazon doing videos, buying Twitch. They're all just trying to figure out what the next big money maker is, right? It's why Google split up with Alphabet like that, just to try and reach in all sorts of different directions. Exactly. So we were saying that these large banks and these lenders, right? They don't necessarily want to rent out real estate to some tenant, right? They just want to sell it and forget about it. They don't want to be property managers.
Yep.
Is that true about tech companies?
Who knows what Jeff Bezos wants to do?
Right, but I mean, look, maybe we're going to be seeing Amazon homes in New York.
Yeah.
Integrated Alexa.
Maybe they'll try
a toilet that reports to Bezos every time you use it.
Yeah, maybe they'll try to make something that actually works. That's like WeWork, but that actually WeWork.
Yeah, or maybe like a WeWork that works. That's a good thought. Actually, a very good thought. Maybe they'll try that. Or
an urban campus.
Yeah. Now that I think about that, that makes the most sense. Something like WeWork, but an urban campus could be a real thing too. Like they could even start buying up apartment buildings or buying up, hotels and converting them to apartments for their workers.
Right.
Like, offering it as a form of compensation. Like,
right.
Just because, a lot of times, a lot of these bigger companies, that when they employ someone, that's worth a lot, essentially what they're trying to do is like trap them in the company in a way, so they don't run away. And one of the ways you can do that is by making it a huge hassle if they actually leave. So,
Yeah.
maybe
And
we'll see the rebirth of company stores and company homes.
yeah, but I think on the other side of that, aside from tech companies, a lot of bigger companies, Goldman, BlackRock, they um, they've been observing how well, like we said, work from home is working. And do you think that contradicts with what we've been saying, or do you think that there's going to be a hybrid model where people come in for two days?
There's absolutely going to be a hybrid model. There's no question about it. There's going to be a hybrid model. Like
Right.
life in the U.S. is not configured properly for this, for constant work from home, for never leaving the apartment, essentially. It's just
Right. No, of course, but it's definitely working way better than, say, what was happening after 9/11.
Yeah. So like, there's not going to be a huge, like, sudden sucking sound where suddenly no one's in a city, right? There are a lot of benefits to in-person office space. Like a lot. But yeah, it's going to decrease, and I think the form is going to change. And like you were saying, the idea like that they would buy up these areas and have them essentially be another campus, or change the amount of time you have to actually go into work. I think that's very likely.
Yeah.
Actually, even before the crisis, a lot of tech companies had very liberal work from home policies. So I think you're probably going to see that kind of expand. I think you're going to see people spend less time in the office. I think you're going to see the general layout of an office change a bit too. Like for the top companies, I think there's going to be very little change because already the offices are very nice. But I think offices in general are going to be focused on being more collaborative work environments. So I think individual offices, like individual companies' offices, are probably going to get smaller.
Yeah, and they're going to have more space to do that.
Yeah, it's going to be like a kind of paradox in that sense, where the office itself is smaller, but it feels like you have more space because there aren't like 9 million desks everywhere.
Yeah.
So that I think is very likely to happen. Then what happens with all the rest of that area? Obviously, like you're saying, more conversions. It's so the question is, maybe you'll be seeing some more even industrial stuff coming into Manhattan, like in the long run. Like maybe not now, but like there are definitely some, like there's the Brooklyn Army Terminal down Sunset Park, right? I don't know if you've ever been there.
Brooklyn Army
Terminal. Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like this new industrial. They turned that whole former Army Terminal into like basically new industrial space. And so there are like some biotech companies there. There's like a clothing factory that I saw actually a while back, and all these spaces, they don't have to be set in stone like as an office forever. Like it's possible that like some kind of new age manufacturing could be happening in these areas. Like more micro manufacturing, because I guess that could, like with the kind of modularity you're getting in some kinds of new clothing manufacturing, and with the prevalence of computer-aided design, and the kind of machine learning algorithms that make it possible to predict where people are going to be buying things and how much they're going to buy, means that I think you'll also see like centralized factories becoming less common. I mean, in general, I think this whole thing is going to be leading to a lot of decentralization. But I think the city itself is still going to be fun. It's just going to be different.
No, of course. Like, I mean, in 36 months, New York is still going to be not the center of everything, but it's still going to be very major. But there's definitely going to be a shifted dynamic in terms of how people live in the city, especially in Manhattan. Can we talk about how Manhattan, how all of this is, whatever that's happening is not, it's not 100% new, because Manhattan has seen a decline in residents gradually in the past like 3 years. That was happening before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And what the pandemic has done is basically accelerate all of this. Not just the people moving out part. The retail, healthcare. That's internationally. These changes were in a sense meant to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. This is, this is like the prototypical Black Swan event, right? Where everything that people thought would happen in like 15 years suddenly happens a lot faster because of some external shock, right?
Right.
So you have the same thing happening years ago during the this like back in the 30s, right, with World War II. But that was another kind of, I don't know if you call it Black Swan event, maybe, but it was another big shock, right? And it changed the way the economy worked, but it was where the economy was going anyway,
Right.
You have women entering the workforce en masse. You had sudden proliferation of the middle class, sudden booming expansion of it, right? These were all things that were kind of pressured and growing, but like in the end, that's what triggered it. But it was going to happen anyway. And this is kind of the same situation, I think. Like I completely agree with you. Yeah.
So aside from monetary policy, some of the solutions to what we're facing right now, one of the solutions is that people are suggesting for the government to reopen widely, stuff like malls, retail stores, and reopen. Definitely, the capacity they're suggesting is definitely beyond 25%, which is what New York City currently is maintaining. What do you think about that? Because it seems very logical to me. If I own a mall, it seems very logical to me that, hey, government, just reopen. I'm going bankrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I can absolutely sympathize with those people. I run my own business, and I've been an investor in a friend's business, and I can say that it does definitely suck. Ultimately, you can't have the people who are going to be negatively impacted by this make all the decisions about it, right? Because at that point, they're only thinking about their own interests, but they aren't actually thinking about their own long-term interests. They're thinking about their short-term interests, right? So what's the long-term interest? Well, long-term interest, and what do you do to kind of save yourself from the pandemic is that kind of business. Sometimes the answer is there's nothing you can do, with short of like the government literally paying you while you're closed, right? And so I can understand why they think the opening would be a solution. But, and this is something I guess we can talk about next week. The reality is that actually opening does not actually help the economy. It doesn't. Like, it sounds counterintuitive, but what we found is like what the research has found in general is that the areas that stayed open, like specifically, Sweden, and we can talk about this more in depth another time, but they stay open, right? Their economy didn't actually do that much better. And they had the same number of deaths as the places, like they had the same number of deaths as us. Yeah. Right? Like sorry, not the same number, the same ratio kind of thing,
Right. And on top of that, they have people that lost their lives.
Right. So, if you look at Sweden, like that's supposed to be a success story, but in reality it wasn't really, because the economy shit itself there too. Yeah. And like, because the thing is, and this is the short take on it, like if people are dying around you everywhere, you notice. like I mean, here you heard the sirens constantly. Like there were ambulances everywhere when COVID was really bad. You could literally walk to the hospital and see the corpse trucks, and like when that happens, people don't want to go to a restaurant. So like that's reality. So if you leave it open, the infection goes out of control. And when it goes out of control, you have a shitload of people die, and then people go, oh, Jesus, I don't want to die. They don't do anything. They don't go out. So you have the exact same problem where your business just dries up and shits itself. So like in the long run, what you really have to do is have a clean shutdown.
Yes.
And, you know, what's the area that actually bounced back quickly from this whole thing? It's basically Asia, you know, Korea, China, these places that shut down and did contact tracing effectively and like didn't wait, just shut down instantly. You know, they had a short shutdown. It was the lowest shock you could have, because ultimately there is no way to fix this without a shock. There just isn't, you know? Like either the shock is going to be when people notice all their friends dying and they stop going out and buying things, or it's going to be when you shut the whole economy down. No, I mean, you know, the biggest issue here isn't so much there was a shutdown, but this shutdown's been staggered out all over the country. Like
and it's mostly just voluntary.
Yeah, I mean, there's
compared to what other countries have been doing.
Yeah, exactly. There's no enforcement mechanism really. And like there's even debate whether we can have an enforcement mechanism here in the U.S. under the law with the law and the Constitution. You know, so yeah, I mean that's the short version. We can talk about this more. Tune
in next week.
Yeah, tune in next
week. For more rent. On the pandemic.
We'll talk about this, and we'll talk about new investors, Wall Street bets, and stuff like that too. I think those guys are crazy.
Exciting stuff. Exciting stuff.
Well, you know, I mean, that's everything that we intend to cover this week. Next week, we'll probably cover some stuff about what we were just talking about, basically what the actual impact of a shutdown is, whether it's better to leave the economy open or just shut down, some ideas about that. And then we'll probably also talk a little bit about new investors, the wave of new apps and fintech that's allowing places like Wall Street bets to exist and thrive. I'm not sure thrive is the right word for losing $100,000 in 2 weeks, but you know, we'll talk about that. And it's been fun talking about the topics this week. I hope you guys will join us again next week. Bye-bye.
That's it. Wait. So that's it.
Bye-bye.
That's it. Bye.